All right, welcome to our lecture about pollution, and the slides in this case are designed to accompany the book The Cultural Landscape. I am, of course, Miss Gall. I'll be your lecturer today. So first thing we want to talk about is why are resources being polluted? And truth be told, resources are being polluted basically through the products of industrialization in everyday life. Okay, so when we look at something like, say, air pollution, we look at it on a global scale and look at issues like global warming, which comes into play when we talk about things like the greenhouse effect. And again, the greenhouse effect is in essence the release of carbon dioxide and a few other gases into the atmosphere. And what they do is that they function kind of like the windows in a greenhouse, in that they let the light in, and then once it bounces off the earth and tries to bounce back out, it bounces it back in. So it kind of helps keep the heat in. Okay, but along with that, we could also look at things like the ozone layer and CFCs. And if you're not familiar with that term CFC, it stands for chlorofluorocarbon. And basically what's happening with the ozone layers, the ozone layer is one of those things that helps keep out radiation. And CFCs degrade the ozone layer and break it down, and so there's some thinning and also I believe some holes in the ozone layer. And so what that does is that makes us then more prone to problems with things like sunburn and the like, just because the atmosphere is not providing the kind of protection to my child that it provided to me, for instance, when I played outside. When we're looking at resources on a regional scale, or air pollution on a regional scale, then we can start to look at acid rain and also what's called acid deposition. And so basically acid precipitation, of course, water that falls from the sky, either in the form of snow or in the form of rain. And deposition just means that we're adding it back into the environment. And the way that this happens is that there are some chemicals, mostly sulfates, that when they're deposited into the atmosphere cause raindrops to basically kind of coalesce around them. And then when it rains, they drop back out of the atmosphere, and they're acidic, and so they essentially burn plants and animals, and they can cause all kinds of other problems, harm the growing environment and the like. And we're looking at the local scale. When we look at air pollution, then we can look at issues like carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and photochemical smogs, particulates. These are, you hear about these from time to time. Probably the most famous example you guys are the most familiar with would be the Olympics not too long ago in Beijing, where a lot of athletes were threatening to boycott if they couldn't get the smog down. Okay, so in essence, what happens at the local scale is that you can get, for lack of a better term, pockets of smog trapped around cities in particular that then cause problems for anybody who's even remotely sensitive to them. So for instance, here in Seattle, we have days where they warn people who are sensitive not to go outside, for example. Okay. When we look at global warming, a few trends to look at. The map on the left is the average global temperature in degrees Celsius. And as you can see, and we're looking from 1880 to about present, little after 2000, you can see that it's kind of holding steady till about 1920, starts to trend up a little bit, and goes back down between 40 and 60, and then all of a sudden just skyrockets. In essence, kind of hitting what looks like a tipping point. And so it may go up or down from year to year, but what you'll notice is the overall trend line tends towards going up. If we look at the graph on the right, what we're looking at is global carbon dioxide emissions. And carbon dioxide's a great way to measure this, just because it's easy to measure and it's fairly well standardized. Okay, and what you can see a clear trend upward, and you see in that same time frame where we see the trend up in terms of temperature, there's also a really significant trend upwards in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. And again, carbon dioxide emissions help keep and trap heat in the environment, making it much warmer, which much warmer is relative, right? Because over 2 degrees Celsius in terms of the overall trend is, generally speaking, would be considered to be catastrophic. So if we look at acid deposition, and this would be what we would see put in, again, acid put into the soil commonly from industrial sites, you'll notice that it really matches up very closely with mining, right, with anything that's got to do with industry, heavy industry, right? So for instance, in the Great Lakes area, Detroit, Chicago, thereabouts, there's tons and tons and tons. Same thing when we're looking at the map on the right, which is the map of Europe. We can see large areas of France and Germany that are problematic, okay, that are particularly problematic, I should say. So just something to keep in mind, that this is related to heavy industry, and so acid deposition levels are actually changing around the world, right? We work here in the US, we're working to clean them up, but the reality is, because a lot of our cars and things get made overseas, really what we've done is just outsource the problem. So if we're talking, shift now a little bit and talk about water pollution, there's lots of sources for water pollution. Okay, so we could look at agriculture, and agriculture is a huge one with the use of various chemicals, right? So for instance, weed killers are very harmful to aquatic life, right? But also fertilizers, which you see, it's this crazy thing where farmers fertilize their fields, it runs off into a river system, makes its way out into the ocean, then you get these huge algal blooms, and what they do is they first of all shade everything down below, so the water doesn't get necessarily as warm as it should, and it doesn't get as much sunlight as it should, but they also suck up all the oxygen, and so you end up with these huge dead zones, which is a problem, because no wildlife can live in those areas, right? But it's not just agriculture that's the problem. It's really any water-using industry that's going to be the problem. And so this is everything from power plants to manufacturing, right? Most things that use water put things into the water. And so if we're not filtering that out, then it goes into the environment, gets deposited into the soil, maybe filters into the river system, and on down the food chain. Right? That includes, by the way, municipal uses. So for instance, here in Western Washington, in Des Moines, which is where I live, not only when we're talking about municipal uses are we talking about things like just water delivery and then taking away water, right? Taking away wastewater. We're also talking about things like the stormwater system. And so stormwater oftentimes washes off the road, down a drain, and then just straight out into the ocean. But the trick is, it also takes any chemicals and stuff that are on the ground, right? So all of this has a cumulative impact that's causing lots and lots of long-term problems. It's got an impact on aquatic life, right? Again, it changes that biochemical oxygen demand that we were talking about earlier, where there's dead zones in the ocean because nothing can live there because all of the algae is eating up all the oxygen, right? We also see, wastewater is not healthy for us, so it's certainly not healthy for ocean life, and that can cause widespread disease. And so we're seeing diseases and things in areas where we've never seen it before. We're seeing diseases develop as various plants and animals are being impacted negatively by our choices and the ways in which we're using water. We talk about land pollution. That becomes a whole separate issue because ultimately it'll impact the water, right? It'll impact all kinds of things. So we talk about things like solid waste disposal. Solid waste, honestly guys, it's your trash, okay? And really there's a handful of ways to deal with trash, okay? So here in Western Washington we have landfills, and basically what a landfill is, a lot like the name implies, you send your trash there, they spread it out over the ground, and they put a layer of dirt on top of it, and they spread more trash, and they put a layer of dirt, and they spread more trash, and they put a layer of dirt. And then ultimately, long term, you've got this really fairly heavily polluted site because it's got all all this different stuff breaking down, everything from food waste to plastic bags, right? That theoretically is safe to build on and use, but a lot of people don't really want to, and a lot of those chemicals and things are seeping down into the water. They're causing problems for animals who live underground, right? So there are a handful of alternatives to doing this landfill thing, one of which is incineration. The problem with incineration, which is, by the way, a fancy word for burning things, is that when you burn things, you release all kinds of chemicals into the air. And so now you've got carbon dioxide going up there. A lot of times you've got sulfur dioxide going up there. And so we end up with those problems we were talking about, like with acid rain and the greenhouse effect and things like that. One of those things you can do, though, to minimize or limit the impact of your trash on landfills and the like is to go ahead and recycle, to make sure that you're cleaning out your bottles and all of that and sending them out to the recycle plant instead of just tossing them in the trash can, and also doing the same thing with your food waste, right? And in the United States, just to give you some idea, so hazardous is just a fancy word that means dangerous, but dangerous waste disposal in 2007, so about 10 years ago, 47 million tons. 47 million tons disposed of just in the United States alone. Okay. There are some renewable resources that we could talk about, right? We talk about nuclear energy, which is very clean. It doesn't have a lot of those environmental side effects. It doesn't give off carbon dioxide the same way coal-fired power plants do and the like. No greenhouse gases, but it has its downsides too, right? Nuclear energy creates waste that doesn't go away for millions of years, and there's a lot of debate about where do we put this waste, and it's a huge thing in Congress, for instance, because we used to put it in Nevada and Nevada doesn't want it anymore. So what are we going to do with it, right? We also have the potential for accidents, and unlike in a lot of power plants, if a nuclear power plant has an accident, that's a huge problem for a whole lot of people, as the folks in Japan found out not too long ago when there was a huge tsunami and an earthquake that knocked out the Fukushima power plant, and now they've got a huge area that's basically uninhabitable because the power plant broke down and leaked, right? Russia found out the same problem. They're still dealing with the fallout from their nuclear power plant meltdown. Also, you know, nuclear energy at the end of the day, it's the same material that they use to make nuclear bombs. So you got to be careful about who's got access to that and what does that mean and what do we do, you know, how do we keep everything safe? It's also very expensive to build and maintain a nuclear reactor, and we've got limited uranium reserves, and really we create nuclear power. Uranium's kind of the most popular way to do that. All right, so there's limited reserves of this stuff, and you do run the risk of running out. Again, it's cleaner, in many ways a better option, but it's still not a perfect option, and it's one that increasingly, especially in the developed world, is being rejected. I was just reading an article not too long ago that was talking about some of those newly industrializing countries, though, building more nuclear power plants because of the fact that it would help offset global warming. Right, so this has been our lecture on pollution, and we talked a little bit about water pollution, we talked about land pollution, we talked about nuclear energy and the role it can play in helping clean this stuff up. We've talked really about quite a bit, but if you have questions, please feel free to come see me during class, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have.